Karoline Leavitt opens with a firestorm of revelations, tearing apart the pristine image that has been carefully constructed around one of the most iconic figures in American media. For decades, this woman has been painted as a symbol of inspiration, empowerment, and philanthropy. But according to Karoline, that glossy persona is nothing more than a calculated mask, one designed to manipulate public perception and shield a deeply troubling reality beneath the surface. The public has been conditioned to see her as a comforting presence, someone who represents hope, success, and self-help. Her story has been sold as the ultimate rags-to-riches tale. But Karoline challenges this narrative at its core, arguing that what we've actually witnessed is a highly orchestrated campaign of distraction, a brilliant piece of media manipulation, designed to distract the American people from the power plays happening behind the scenes. She describes it as a stage show, where the lights and camera draw the audience in while the real business, the deals, the alliances, the influence, happens in the shadows. Karoline doesn't come with vague accusations. She lays out a pattern of behavior and public moves that raise serious red flags. From using her media platform to push specific political narratives, to handpicking guests and topics that subtly guide cultural opinions, she shows how this media titan has quietly shaped the beliefs of millions, not through honest dialogue, but through selective presentation of truth. Karoline argues that this power over perception has made her one of the most dangerous figures in the modern media landscape. Not because she screams her opinions, but because she whispers them with the tone of a trusted friend, a friend who's actually serving someone else's interests. What becomes clear through Karoline's speech is that there's been a long-term agenda at play, one that involves leveraging media influence to build relationships with power brokers across business, politics, and entertainment. While the public was busy applauding her book club picks and televised giveaways, she was building a quiet empire, not just of wealth, but of access and leverage. Karoline points to the curated nature of her brand as evidence of how calculated everything is. Nothing is spontaneous. Every appearance, every endorsement, every cause, meticulously chosen not for passion, but for positioning. She also zeroes in on the hypocrisy that surrounds her public messaging. Karoline makes a compelling case that this woman has spent years preaching virtue and moral responsibility while engaging in partnerships and practices that betray those very principles. Whether it's promoting causes that later turn out to be entangled in corruption, or maintaining close ties with individuals whose values are completely at odds with what she claims to represent, the contradictions pile up fast. According to Karoline, this isn't accidental. It's the kind of selective morality that only works when you control the narrative. Karoline urges the audience to look beyond the surface, to question why certain people are untouchable in the media, why criticism of them is almost instantly shut down, and why so many powerful voices seem to orbit around them in silence. She suggests that what we're seeing is not fame, but manufactured reverence, a cultural protection racket where image is weaponized to prevent scrutiny. This illusion of perfection becomes a shield, and Karoline's mission is to crack that shield wide open. She emphasizes how dangerous this kind of unchecked adoration can be in a country that relies on free thinking and open debate. When a single person is allowed to amass both emotional loyalty and political capital without real accountability, the risk isn't just media bias, it's cultural mind control. Karoline isn't asking people to hate, cancel, or condemn blindly. She's asking them to wake up, to stop assuming that because someone seems kind, or gives generously, or speaks calmly, that they are inherently trustworthy. The core of Karoline's message is this: don't fall for the packaging. The soft tone, the clean image, the feel-good storytelling, all of it has been used as a smokescreen. Behind that veil lies a very real, very strategic operation that has gone unchecked for far too long. Karoline Leavitt doesn't just rely on emotional appeals or vague claims. She comes with a trail of data, receipts, and connections that paint a much darker picture than most people are willing to admit. The central thesis is that beneath the polished public persona and the glow of mainstream adoration, there lies a network of financial ties and affiliations that reveal a very different agenda, one rooted in control, influence, and manipulation. These aren't random associations. They are deliberate, strategic relationships that serve to advance specific narratives and consolidate power in the hands of a select few. Karoline begins by highlighting how money flows behind the scenes to create the illusion of independence. While the public sees a self-made media mogul, Karoline argues that much of the success was made possible by backing from massive institutions, tech giants, and globalist organizations. These aren't just friendly sponsors or casual partners. These are entities with long histories of pushing centralized control, social engineering, and ideological conformity. The relationship goes both ways. She promotes their causes, and in return, they elevate her platform and protect her brand from criticism. She lays out a disturbing pattern of how these financial ties extend into foundations and nonprofit initiatives that are marketed as charitable but function more like influence machines. Massive donations flow into carefully branded philanthropic efforts, which on the surface appear to be about education, health, and empowerment. But when examined closely, Karoline argues, these programs often align perfectly with political agendas, designed to reshape culture, redefine values, and silence dissent. She describes them not as charities, but as soft power tools, vehicles for narrative control disguised as benevolence. According to Karoline, it's no accident that certain causes are given endless airtime while others are ignored entirely. This selectivity isn't based on merit or urgency. It's based on which issues support the long-term vision of the networks funding them. She presents documented cases of partnerships with organizations whose leadership and funding sources have clear, traceable ties to major political players. These are not impartial groups. They have goals, and they use influential media figures to achieve them. The media isn't just reporting on society, it's actively engineering it. Karoline points out that these financial and ideological alliances often remain hidden because of a well-oiled system of image management. Whenever inconvenient questions arise, there's a swift response, deflections, PR spin, and curated media coverage designed to kill the story. She stresses that the deeper you look into these relationships, the more coordinated they appear. Conferences, book deals, award shows, even public debates, all choreographed to project authenticity while masking the scripted nature of the message being delivered. It's not about truth, she says. It's about branding a worldview and selling it as moral authority. She also examines how this web of influence extends into education, technology, and even global policy. Karoline walks the audience through examples where seemingly neutral projects in education or wellness were actually conduits for introducing controversial ideas, all while hiding behind the trusted face of a public figure. She argues that parents, communities, and even local leaders often don't realize what's happening until it's too late, because the public trust in the messenger blinds them to the content being pushed. It's an infiltration through trust, not force. At the center of it all, Karoline claims, is a hunger for control. Not the kind that comes from political office or direct legislation, but something far more insidious: cultural authority. By shaping what people believe, what they value, and what they fear, this network of influence essentially bypasses the democratic process. When you control the emotional and moral frameworks of a population, you don't need to pass laws. People will police themselves. And when those frameworks are built on falsehoods, the result is mass compliance with ideas that would never survive open debate. Karoline's breakdown of the financial entanglements and ideological synchronization is meant to shatter the illusion of neutrality. What she's exposing is a sophisticated operation where power is amassed through sentiment, and money is used not to uplift communities, but to control the narrative. The smiling face, the inspirational speeches, the emotional monologues, all carefully designed to keep the public in a dream state while larger forces maneuver behind the curtain. This isn't about simple corruption or greed. It's about the use of influence to shift the entire trajectory of a society, and doing so with the full complicity of media, corporations, and political institutions that benefit from keeping the truth obscured. Karoline Leavitt brings a striking twist to the story with a revelation that turns the spotlight back onto those who built their brands around cancel culture. For years, the machinery of media and celebrity influence has been used to tear down people for having opinions outside the mainstream, for questioning dominant narratives, or for refusing to bend to ideological trends. But now, Karoline points out, that very machine is turning inward, devouring one of its most high-profile architects. The irony is glaring. After decades of wielding influence to shape public opinion and punish dissenters, the cultural tide is shifting, and the reckoning is coming from within. She draws a powerful contrast between the persona that has been carefully crafted over the years and the reality now catching up with it. For a long time, there was a perceived immunity. No matter how controversial a stance was taken or how deeply connected someone was to questionable figures and causes, there was always a protective bubble, a circle of praise, silence, and curated image. Karoline argues that this shield came not from truth or virtue, but from status, branding, and a deeply embedded relationship with the institutions that shape public perception. But now that immunity is cracking, the very culture that once celebrated every word and applauded every move is beginning to ask questions, not because of a sudden moral awakening, but because the illusion of perfection is no longer sustainable. Karoline emphasizes how the same voices that once defended and uplifted are now openly criticizing, distancing themselves, or remaining suspiciously silent. The cancel culture storm that swept through industries, careers, and communities is now circling back towards someone who helped normalize its rise. Karoline doesn't celebrate this out of spite. She highlights it as a moment of accountability. A moment when the system turns on itself and shows the flaws in the very ideology it promoted. What makes this reversal even more significant is that it exposes the selective nature of outrage. Karoline points out how, for years, people were vilified, for far less, for tweets, for jokes, for taking unpopular positions. Yet when powerful figures were caught in contradictory, even damaging alliances, or used their platforms to push divisive rhetoric, the response was silence, deflection, or even applause. This selective enforcement of moral standards wasn't about justice. It was about control. It wasn't about protecting the public. It was about protecting an agenda. And now that agenda is being questioned, not just by critics, but by the very culture that once enforced it. Karoline challenges the audience to think about what cancel culture has actually accomplished. Has it made people more honest? Has it fostered real dialogue? Or has it created a climate of fear, where disagreement is seen as betrayal and silence is safer than truth? She argues that what we're seeing now is the inevitable collapse of a system built on moral superiority without moral consistency. When the enforcers of cancel culture find themselves on the receiving end, it reveals that no one is truly safe, not even those who thought they were untouchable. She also points out how quickly the tone has changed. Media outlets that once ran glowing profiles are now digging into past decisions and demanding explanations. Former allies are beginning to hedge their words. Influencers who once treated her words as gospel are now curiously disengaged. Karoline sees this not just as poetic justice, but as a warning. The game of public opinion is unstable, and once you empower a culture of condemnation without forgiveness or balance, you risk becoming its next target. Influence and goodwill are fleeting when they are not grounded in authenticity and principle. Karoline doesn't frame this downfall as a personal failure, but as a systemic one. When fame is used to advance ideological goals without accountability, when popularity shields people from criticism, and when virtue is performed instead of practiced, collapse is only a matter of time. What's happening now is not just a scandal, it's an unraveling. It's a moment where the contradictions finally outweigh the narrative, and where people begin to see that the story they were sold was never the full truth. In a way, this moment is less about one individual and more about the end of a certain kind of influence, the kind that thrives on image over integrity, on power without scrutiny, and on silence in the face of hypocrisy. Karoline calls attention to this not to gloat, but to urge a cultural reset, to move away from worshiping personalities and start questioning the systems that elevate them. Because if even those who once controlled the narrative can be cast out by it, then maybe the narrative itself was never about truth. It was always about power. Karoline Leavitt takes her message to a broader battlefield in her fourth point, lifting the discussion out of the realm of one person and into something far more consequential. What's at stake, she argues, is not just the fall of a media figure or the unraveling of a false narrative. It's something much larger, A fight over who gets to define truth, shape values, and ultimately control the cultural direction of an entire country. This isn't about gossip or scandal, it's about the mechanisms of influence that silently steer national identity, often without the people realizing it. She explains that cultural influence has become the most powerful weapon in modern society. No longer is control exercised primarily through politics or military strength. Instead, it's done through stories, symbols, and emotional manipulation. What people watch, read, share, and repeat forms the foundation of what they believe to be right or wrong, just or unjust, real or fake. The individuals and institutions that have mastered this form of control don't need to shout orders. They merely need to push narratives subtly, consistently, and with the right emotional framing. Karoline emphasizes that this is how cultural authority is built, not through logic or transparency, but through repetition, trust, and unexamined influence. Throughout her speech, she underscores the idea that the real battleground isn't television, politics, or celebrity. It's the human mind, specifically what people are conditioned to think and feel. When one figure has the ability to shape how millions of people interpret events, values, and even themselves, that's not just influence. That's psychological domination. And the danger, Karoline says, is that most people don't realize it's happening. They confuse charisma with truth, emotional appeal with moral clarity, and familiarity with trustworthiness. That confusion, she warns, is how freedom begins to erode. Karoline explains that this influence has been used to engineer compliance, not through coercion, but through subtle manipulation. Certain ideas are presented as self-evident, even when they're highly political. Dissent is not debated, it's dismissed. Those who question the dominant views are not engaged, they are labeled. Over time, this builds a culture where conformity is seen as virtue, and silence is seen as wisdom. The result is a population that no longer thinks critically, but repeats slogans and praises figures who reflect their programmed values. Karoline's point is that this is not a coincidence. It's a strategy. She paints a vivid picture of how this cultural engineering operates through what she calls soft power, influence that feels benevolent but carries a hidden agenda. It happens when media stories push emotional narratives that obscure facts. It happens when educational programs promote ideological messages wrapped in the language of compassion. It happens when influential figures are elevated to near religious status so that disagreeing with them feels like sacrilege. And it happens when institutions encourage people to align with identity groups and victim narratives instead of embracing unity and shared responsibility. Karoline insists that what's being lost in this process is the very thing that makes a nation strong, the ability to disagree openly, to think independently, and to pursue truth without fear. She challenges her audience to recognize that control doesn't always look like tyranny. Sometimes it looks like a smiling face telling you what to believe. And sometimes the people doing the most harm are the ones cloaked in praise, prestige, and moral language. That's why, she says, it's so critical to question everything, not from a place of cynicism, but from a place of responsibility. She reminds listeners that truth doesn't require censorship. It doesn't require image control or narrative shaping. If something is true, it can stand on its own. But when enormous energy is put into managing perception, silencing critics, and punishing those who deviate, it should raise red flags. Karoline argues that the very tools used to create cultural unity, media, education, entertainment, have been hijacked by those with ideological motives. And as long as people continue to absorb without questioning, the control will grow deeper, stronger, and more difficult to resist. Karoline's message is ultimately a call for awakening. Not rebellion, not outrage for outrage's sake, but awareness. She believes that once people begin to see the mechanisms of control for what they are, once they stop idolizing individuals and start analyzing systems, then real change becomes possible. Influence only works when it's invisible. But the moment people start naming it, questioning it, and pulling back the curtain, that influence begins to lose its grip. Karoline Leavitt closes her message with a sense of urgency, not outrage. She doesn't want applause. She wants awareness. Her goal is not to destroy a person, but to dismantle the illusion that has kept millions complacent and disconnected from the truth. She reminds her audience that the real issue isn't one public figure, no matter how powerful or polished they appear. The real issue is the system that allowed such influence to grow unchecked, the silence that protected it, and the passive acceptance of narratives without scrutiny. In her final words, she urges people to reclaim their ability to think critically. She challenges the idea that questioning a beloved public figure is an act of betrayal. It's not betrayal, she says, it's responsibility. In a society built on freedom, the burden doesn't fall only on leaders or media personalities. It falls on citizens. Each person has a role in protecting truth, defending open dialogue, and refusing to let emotional appeal replace honest evidence. The moment we stop asking questions, we begin surrendering our agency. She speaks to those who once believed the narrative without doubt, not with condemnation, but with compassion. It's not shameful to have been misled, she says. What matters is what you do once the truth becomes clear. Do you double down on the lie, or do you rise above it? Karoline encourages her audience to take the harder path, to step out of the comfort of cultural conformity and into the uncertainty of independent thought. It's not easy. It requires humility, courage, and the willingness to admit when we've been wrong. But it's the only way to rebuild a culture that values honesty over popularity, principle over image. Karoline ends with a firm reminder that the truth is never afraid of scrutiny. Only lies require protection through censorship, emotional manipulation, or blind loyalty. If the stories we've been told are true, they will survive the heat of honest investigation. But if they aren't, we owe it to ourselves and to future generations to expose them. Because influence, when unchecked, becomes indoctrination. And a free society can't function if its people no longer know how to tell the difference. In her final words, she doesn't call for cancellation. She calls for clarity. She asks the audience to stop worshiping personalities and start defending truth, to be brave enough to think for themselves, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it goes against everything they've been told to believe. Because in the end, the greatest form of resistance isn't shouting louder, it's seeing clearly. And once you see, you can't unsee. Once you know, you can't unknow. And once the illusion breaks, control loses its power.